Night in the Woods is a very interesting game, though not one that I would just recommend to everyone. Though I enjoyed it greatly myself, it's not the kind of game that just anyone can enjoy. Though if you are around the age of 20 and are all depressed or empathetic or wondering your place in the world, then this game is 100% for you. But to me, one of the most interesting things about this game was Possum Springs, the town that the game takes place in. It's one of the most interesting, unique, realistic, and relatable settings in a video game that I have played. So yes, there will be spoilers here, but nothing super major, at least not until later. So, let's learn about Possum Springs and its inspiration from the sad reality that is the Rust Belt. Now, maybe it's just me and my West Coast education, but I haven't heard the term Rust Belt until just about a year ago. And as I think about this, I feel like this video may be common knowledge to those who live in it. But for me, and I assume many of the rest on this side of the country, it's all new information. But even though I had no idea what a Rust Belt was when I first heard it, thankfully I was able to piece together where it was just by the name of it. It's this area of the United States, mainly Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, but also crossing into Pennsylvania, Illinois, and western New York. And it gets the name Rust Belt because, well, basically, it's falling apart. The most famous city in the Rust Belt is, of course, Detroit, so think about everything famous and well-known about Detroit, but spread that throughout small towns scattered across that part of the country. Here we see the modern ruins of a prosperous past. In the mid-20th century, this part of America was at its richest. Its factories and mines were pumping out products left and right, and the big ones too. Coal, cars, construction equipment, machinery, steel, lumber, everything. And this is reflected in Night in the Woods well. Possum Springs was a mining town, and the locals are proud of it, spanning murals of their prosperous time along the walls and erecting monuments. Their local sports team are the Smelters, named after their once prosperous smelting facilities in the area. And the older citizens refer to the good old days frequently. These older citizens mostly would have been from the baby boomer generation, the time when this area was at its most prosperous. They grew up in an ever-improving world of high middle-class living, only for things to come crumbling down in their adulthood. And the kids these days, they don't understand that things used to be better, because they grew up at its worst. But why did it crumble? Well, that depends on the political views of who you are asking. Those on the right will often say it's because taxes and regulations got too costly, which causes these businesses, mines, and factories to either shut down or relocate to where it's cheaper. And those on the left will tell you that it's greedy CEOs moving out to where they can line their own pockets more. And in reality, it's definitely a mixture of the two. It's both, along with the added factor of technological improvement. I mean, one miner with a machine can do the same work in a day that 10 miners could in a week 60 years ago. And yes, it did become significantly cheaper for these factories to move elsewhere because of regulations and taxes. But many, though not all of those regulations, were for safety's sake. After all, mines and factories are dangerous places. So it can be viewed as greedy CEOs just wanting to move instead of spending money on guardrails and paperwork, but it also makes business sense. Just take me for example. Just a few months ago I moved out of California because the cost of living is too high and they tax me too much. Being a YouTuber is considered running your own small business, so I moved to Oregon for business reasons, and because the weather is so much nicer here. Factories, especially at the time, tend to have good wages, supporting tons of middle-class families just from one person, usually the father, working there. So when these factories leave, suddenly these middle-class families are stuck with middle-class bills to pay, but are stuck working for lower wages at retail jobs. And that's if there are even any of those left. This aspect is reflected by May's dad. He used to work in the mines himself, but now works at a grocery store and he hates it. May's mom has to work now too, and it sounds like despite their efforts, something is going to happen to their house. They probably can't afford to keep it up anymore. Beatrice and her father run a business together, but recently had to drastically downscale to a small, worn-down apartment because they simply couldn't afford the nice house anymore. the Rust Belt is full of empty houses, especially nicer empty houses, at least they used to be nicer. All of the middle and higher class people left, or dropped into the lower class. Foreclosures skyrocketed, and most people could no longer afford to keep their houses. The same goes for parks, schools, and businesses, because if people can barely afford their small houses and apartments, then they don't have leftover money to spend at other businesses, so those businesses don't make enough money to stay afloat. So they either fail or move out to a more prosperous area, leaving the Rust Belt town even more empty and worn down. At one point, you drive for an hour just to get to a mall, a nicer place to shop and hang out, but even it is a bit run down and empty. And this is the point in the game that resonated with me the most, because this particular aspect is happening across the country, not just in the Rust Belt. Malls suck nowadays, at least compared to how they used to be. And why? Well, Beatrice says it pretty clearly: because of the internet. There are many articles and predictions from economists that state that a mall-pocalypse is about to happen. It's just around the corner. Multiple mall chain stores can no longer afford to keep running. They can't compete with internet prices and still pay mall rent. Malls charge a lot for rent and haven't really adapted to the times. Most of them don't even realize that they are killing themselves. And while it's hitting malls hardest, the same thing is happening to outlet stores and small businesses in general. The internet is making them obsolete. But while this is hitting the entire nation, it hits the Rust Belt especially hard, since it's almost all they have left. Another point that gets brought up is that the small local businesses are closing first, and they are being replaced with major chain businesses like the Snack Falcon. Seeing this made me relive a bit of culture shock I had a year ago when I first visited Oregon. I had no idea that so many local businesses could exist in one area. My hometown in California is 95% chain stores and restaurants, because the only ones that can afford to exist there are the ones with major corporate backing. But the problem with that is, when you, say, buy a Starbucks coffee at a Walmart, most of that money is going to another part of the country where their headquarters are based, or maybe even out of the country where their headquarters are based. But when you buy a local thing from a local store, all of your money is going to be used to further advance your own local area. You are supporting your local area. That's why there's so much emphasis on buy local. But at this point, the Rust Belt can't afford to support local, because there are so few local businesses there these days, as only major chains can afford to be there. And so it's a cycle, and the people get poorer and poorer. And these effects are well shown in Night in the Woods. Firstly, everything is run down, but also there are lottery ads all over. Notably, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to buy lottery tickets, and lottery companies know this and prey on the poor for their dollar. Lots of the young adults here, especially Beatrice, wished that they could afford to have gone to college at all, but they can't. Too expensive. New technology is expensive too, and even though the game takes place in 2017, most of the tech in the world is outdated from the early aughts. People can't afford to keep up. One of the most prosperous and well-kept local businesses in Possum Springs appears to be the pawn shop, likely because the poor citizens are selling their more valuable belongings to afford food. Another interesting yet obvious statistic is that pawn shops also do better the more poor a particular area is. Also, the poorer an area is, the statistics of crime and drug use skyrocket as well, which is also why the even shadier pawn shops in such areas do well. And this is also referenced by May's friend Casey apparently being in the meth-making business. Another trait of the Rust Belt is sinkholes, which is a recurring point in Night in the Woods too. It's why there is so much construction going on, repairing the sinkholes. The reason sinkholes are such a big problem in this part of the world is because of all of the old abandoned mines just sitting there, empty, slowly eroding holes underground. The surface ground can only stay up for so long. And this segues nicely into the spoileriest part of this video. It's about the underground cult, which, theory, I'm pretty sure consists mostly of the city council members. Though they are the antagonists of the game, I feel like they fit into the relatable category of villains. The ones that have a good point and good intentions and are relatable and understandable, but go about things in not the best way. In this case, they discovered that a sinkhole within one of the abandoned mines leads to an eldritch horror known as the Black Goat, and when they sacrifice someone to it, their town prospers for just a little while. So the connection between them and the city council is obvious. They are the only two groups we see in the game, and they both have the same goal: make the town great again. And there we go, I said it, make the town great again. let's go political. The way I found out about the term Rust Belt is the same way many other people first found out about it. The 2016 US presidential elections. It was the unexpected twist of Rust Belt states turning red that caused Trump to be elected. If you go back and look at these political maps, it's easy to see that while the Rust Belt contains a few swing states, they tend to be bluer. The few times they do go red is when the entire country has a very obvious preference. But in recent years, people have been getting more and more polarized, so most media outlets assumed these states would all be blue because of their more recent history. It's why it was thrown left and right that Clinton had a 90% chance to win, and then she didn't, because of the Rust Belt, a part of the country that is usually ignored. And while being a little stereotypical here, places like BuzzFeed and popular Tumblr blogs will tell you that it's because they are all sexist and racist, even though they dominantly voted for Obama both times before and have been blue for most of history, so why would they suddenly do this? Anyway, the real reason is, like humans, much more complicated, and is much more sadder than that. It's because this part of the nation is called the Rust Belt for a reason.
What do you think of Donald Trump?
I hope he get it. I vote for that black guy 2 times.
Obama.
Barack Obama.
Yeah.
You voted
My
for him 2
papa's a
times.
Democrat. Because you're in the United Mine Workers of America, aren't you? Union worker. My papa was a coal miner.
I worked 26 years in coal mine.
And a few journalists covered it very well. This part of the country is experiencing all of those problems I mentioned earlier and more. Politicians of all kinds on all sides always promise more than they will ever give, of course. But Obama's campaign in particular was one of hope. Hope and change. Which is exactly what the whole Rust Belt wanted at that time, and still wants. They hope for a change that will make their part of the country great again.
Lived in this county for 82 years, and the Democrats, you can look at it. You can look at it.
And after Obama made those promises and fixed almost nothing, well, what's the point in voting for Hillary? One of the major flaws that political analyzers on all sides point to in Hillary's campaign was that she offered very little change. She stood for basically everything that Obama did. Little more, little less. And since Obama did very little for this part of the country, why would Hillary? In fact, Hillary went out of her way to state that she wanted to shut down the last of the coal mines.
Because we're going to put a lot of coal miners and coal companies out of business.
Meanwhile, Trump went out of his way to appeal to the Rust Belt, claiming that he wants to bring those jobs back and make that area great again, which is exactly what the people there want, and what many of them want more than anything. They can look past the flaws that the media pounds and pounds upon constantly because they see voting for him as the greater good for them. And even if he didn't campaign in that area exactly, many political analysts still believe that these states would have voted for him because he still represents some form of change. At least something will be different. At least there will be some, even if minor, some small chance that things will get better for them. And that's all these people want right now. Change for the better, instead of the constant decline, and instead of being ignored. And before the comments turn into a dumpster fire for me daring to say anything remotely, vaguely, slightly positive about Trump, I know, of course he isn't actually doing anything to help at all. In fact, a few of the government programs that he is cutting the funding from are programs specifically made to help that region do better. Welcome to Politics 101. Every politician on every side ever promises more than they will ever be able to do. But the politics of the region and even the rest of the country are well portrayed in Night in the Woods too, albeit subtly. Both the Rust Belt and Possum Springs share a certain dynamic between conservatism and liberalism. The older generation is religious, with churches everywhere. Christendom, in the broadest sense, has both a form of conservatism and generosity involved, though not through liberal means. What I mean is, politically speaking, Christians and even just religious people in general tend to vote more conservatively, yet at the same time tend to be significantly more involved in charity organizations and do more things to help the homeless and such. And you'll notice that the majority of the characters involved in the church, even remotely, are much older. Meanwhile, the discussions you have about spirituality with the younger characters reveal that they tend to go either agnostic or atheist. This, along with the political ideologies we know of in the game, such as B being part of the Young Socialists, goes in line with what is currently happening. Many of the older generations tend to be more conservative in general, while the younger generation right now seems to be the most liberal they've been in modern history. Part of it is due to polarization, of course, but it's also because of, well, everything. Politics, especially in the broadest and generational sense, tends to be complicated. Nobody is purely one thing, everyone is a shade of gray. Or perhaps purple, you could say. Near the end of the game, we see Beatrice talk about the old cult people wanting to gain back the world of a past that barely existed, which is very accurate to how many younger people these days see the older generation. You see on the news older people talking about their glory days, about their booming businesses, about Ronald Reagan, about a time where they could walk into a store with conviction and get a job immediately, a time where things were only getting better. More than anything, the world you grow up in and spend your young adult life in becomes your normal. It makes you who you are. So, kids these days, they don't know, does have some merit to it. Kids these days grow up in a post-9/11 world that is already falling apart, and ghost towns are all over the place now. This is the new normal, and many younger people can't even fathom it being any different. Much like Beatrice, they may have terrible childhoods, working extra hard just to be able to eat TV dinners. If only those businesses had stayed, then things would be better, but they are gone now. Those CEOs and those businesses ruined everything. It's their fault. Forget the business sector. Capitalism ruined everything. The government should help the social sector, so that my life would be better, and so it's more fair. And thus, a socialist is born. This is also exactly why we have phases and flip-flopping political views throughout the generations. Kids grow up being raised by their parents from 1 or 2 generations behind. Plus, they grow up in a world that is being mainly affected and controlled by the previous 2 generations. And because most of us are little rebels, at least on the inside, we want to be different, unique, make a name for ourselves. So we go against that. And while what classifies as conservative versus liberal has changed over the generations, it's notable that baby boomers were, for the time, very liberal. But in turn, they raised Generation X, a much more balanced but leaning a bit towards conservatism generation. By today's standards, though, both fall into conservatism much more, and that factor, along with being raised by boomers and Gen Xers, the millennial generation is the most liberal generation possibly in history. The main characters in Night in the Woods would fall into the very tail end of this generation, and being raised in a more extreme environment of any kind affects your outcome too. In their case, it makes sense that they would lean towards the left. They are living in a falling apart city whose older inhabitants are much more conservative, and from their perspective, are stuck in the past. And because the more conservative government doesn't seem to be interested in helping, well, it just makes sense to do the opposite. And here's a tangential fun fact: the more extreme left views of millennials and early Gen Z kids in general seems to be leading to the bulk of Generation Z being the most conservative generation since the 1940s. At least, according to political, pop media trend, financial, and generational analysts. It just keeps flip-flopping. And speaking of analysts, not to jump on any fear trains, but I've read more than a few times and even did my 6-month-long final project in high school on the prediction that California is going to become the next sort of Rust Belt, which, looking at my hometown, I can see 100%. The politics and policies that definitely benefit Southern California are destroying Northern California. And thus, more and more businesses are moving out of California and moving to states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Washington. But that's a subject I could spend an hour on for another time. To summarize, oftentimes people who live in the area I do, the West Coast, will have no idea about the problems and politics of the Rust Belt. They are confused why and how they could even flip-flop politically so much, especially during the last election. And to those people, I say, check out Night in the Woods. It's easily the most accurate portrayal of that part of the country. Desperate, yet strong and hopeful people of a once prosperous part of the nation. They are strong and do everything they can to stay afloat. Arm in arm, they raise each other up in their small towns. Though, through seeing the continuous decline, some get desperate and will overlook any crimes or misdoings if it potentially works for the greater good of their area. Sure, you could say some are stuck in the past, but at least they haven't given up.
And as an Ohioan, I've certainly experienced a lot of this firsthand. My hometown was pretty much a cookie-cutter Rust Belt area.
Oh hey, it's SwankyBox from the YouTube channel SwankyBox, which has multiple awesomely in-depth videos about Night in the Woods. What brings you here?
Well, you know, I just magically edited my voiceover into your finished video. By the way, did you know the stars and constellations in Night in the Woods and its prequel installments may have foreshadowed the events of the game?
I didn't, but that sounds awesome. Looks like the developers didn't only put details into the Rust Belt aspect, but also the astrological aspect too. I'll definitely check that out and encourage my viewers to do so also. So what do you all think? Is Possum Springs an accurate portrayal of the Rust Belt? And did you expect a big lesson in politics from a video about a game featuring cat gods? Let me know down below. And until next time, please, never stop using your noggin. But for me, and I assume many of the rest on this side of the country, it's all new information. But even though I had no idea what a Rust Belt was when I first heard it, thankfully I was able to piece together where it was just by the name of it. It's this area of the United States, mainly Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, but also crossing into Pennsylvania, Illinois, and western New York. And it gets the name Rust Belt because, well, basically, it's falling apart. The most famous city, Night in the Woods, is a very interesting game, though not one that I would just recommend to everyone. Though I enjoyed it greatly myself, it's not the kind of game that just anyone can enjoy. Though if you are around the age of 20 and are all depressed or empathetic or wondering your place in the world, then this game is 100% for you. But to me, one of the most interesting things about this game was Possum Springs, the town that the game takes place in. It's one of the most interesting, unique, realistic, and relatable settings in a video game that I have played. So yes, there will be spoilers here, but nothing super major, at least not until later. So, let's learn about Possum Springs and its inspiration from the sad reality that is the Rust Belt. Now, maybe it's just me and my West Coast education, but I haven't heard the term Rust Belt until just about a year ago. And as I think about this, I feel like this video may be common knowledge to those who live in it in Night in the Woods well. Possum Springs was a mining town, and the locals are proud of it, spanning murals of their prosperous time along the walls and erecting monuments. Their local sports team are the Smelters, named after their once prosperous smelting facilities in the area. And the older citizens refer to the good old days frequently. These older citizens mostly would have been from the baby boomer generation. The time when this area was at its most prosperous in the Rust Belt is of course Detroit. So think about everything famous and well known about Detroit, but spread that throughout small towns scattered across that part of the country. Here we see the modern ruins of a prosperous past. In the mid-20th century, this part of America was at its richest. Its factories and mines were pumping out products left and right, and the big ones too. Coal, cars, construction equipment, machinery, steel, lumber, everything. And this is reflected